I got it upside down. Idiot. Effectively, sunglasses.
Increased blur, lots of movement, still.
Alright, so firstly, what is an ND filter? Well, it is effectively sunglasses for your camera. A traditional camera has three ways of being able to manage the amount of light that comes into the sensor. Now, the sensor obviously needs to get the right amount of light to not be overexposed and not be underexposed. And you can do that one in a couple of ways. One is we can change the iris. So when we go outside, you notice our eyes close up, and that essentially just reduces the amount of light that can get in. Now, the alternative way to do that is also to use a shutter. So you basically, it's the amount of time that the sensor is exposed to light. So if we do it really fast, it's a small amount of light. If we do it long, a lot more light gets in. When you expose an image for a short time, nothing moves. When you expose it for a longer time, the things that are moving will appear blurred. What we're aiming to do is to get the fast moving stuff like the road blurry so we can see that movement from one frame to the next, and the slower moving stuff in the frame like the bike itself, not blurry. Right? So that's why we use ND filters, and the trick is to get the right filter. Now, with traditional cameras, they have the iris, so they can close off the amount of light getting in. A GoPro does not have that. A GoPro doesn't have an iris. It is basically just the light all gets in. Now, the third piece of that is ISO, which is the sensitivity of the sensor. The more sensitive it is, the more light it can absorb over a short period of time. But it also means that the higher sensitivity, you get graininess in the shot. So we want to avoid high ISO. So when it's bright and sunny like this, what we can do is we put our sunglasses on, it reduces the amount of light coming in, and so then we can lower our shutter speed and slow down the shot a bit. That's why we use them. So the way this ND filter works is you've effectively got, that's the original filter that goes over the top of the lens. So that just protects the lens, it's completely clear. We've then got these filters, which then go over the top to replace it. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to start though with this one, the naked shot, and just show exactly what it looks like without putting an ND filter on. So this is without an ND filter.
This is a naked GoPro straight out of the camera. As I go over those little bits of cracks and the join in the bridge, you can see that's what we're going to use as a reference point. And you can see basically it is completely still in the shot. It should have, particularly because it's a bright sunny day, it should be completely still. Even when you're trying to demo stuff, it's still got to be switched on. So now we're going to swap to an ND8. You can actually do this while you've got the helmet on. You don't have to turn anything off. We can do a quick swap. Basically just look in the mirror so you can see what you're doing. It's going to unscrew that. So it's a quarter turn. Back in the same spot. We've got ND8 there, and then also be careful not to scratch your lens while you're doing this. And there we have ND8. See what that looks like. So I'm not even stopping the camera, right? So I'm not changing any settings. We just keep it rolling. All we've changed is the ND filter. Now, having said that, settings I'm running, I've actually, because it's a bright sunny day and I want to be consistent and just have the shutter speed adjust itself, I've locked the ISO down to 100. So I've set the ISO max to 100. So both ISO max and ISO min are both set to 100, which means that the ISO is locked because we don't have an aperture. So have a look, here we go, over the bridge, the join in the bridge, the cracks. Let's compare those two shots, see how they look different. Now we should be seeing a bit of blur in that join instead. Now, as I said before, the GoPro doesn't have an aperture, right? So it can't close the amount of light down into the iris like a traditional camera does, or like our eyes do. You can only adjust the light by the shutter. A huge amount of light means that it needs a really high shutter speed. So by putting the ND filter on, it's going to allow us to bring that shutter speed back down again.
Alright. Again, not changing any settings, just purely swapping out the filter. With the PolarPros, you have the ND symbol pointing to the top. Click that in. One other thing to consider with ND filters is, yes, they are like sunglasses, but you tend to lose a little bit of colour. Now, cheap ND filters are not very good with blocking out infrared, so PolarPro is usually pretty good. So again, looking at this join in the bridge. Now again, we should see then increased blur, lots of movement. ND16 is probably going to be pretty good. It's also going to be dependent on how much is moving around in the shot. So if you're on a really bumpy trail out in the dirt, then this is probably going to be too much, because the stabilizer is going to be working pretty hard. But out on the road, you tend to have your head a bit steadier, not as much movement, so the stabilizer is not working as hard. You turn it around about. That is ambitious. 3-point turner around about. Now, one thing to consider is as you increase your ND filter, the cheaper ND filters will really struggle to block out the UV light. And what the end result of that is, you can end up with a shot that's a bit red, right? Because it can't block out all the colours. It blocks out the blues and the greens and kind of leaves a bit of red behind. So you end up with a bit of a reddish shade. So of course you can fix that, but it is hard. The ND32 on. Whoa, hang on. This is ND8. I got it upside down. Idiot. Alright, this is our ND32. Now, I suspect it's actually going to be quite dark. I've got that ISO down, locked in at 100. Alright, so ND32. We're either going to see a little too dark. Alright, here we go for the grate again. We're going over the same spot. Two downsides to having an ND filter that's too dark. One is the stabilizer gets all messed up. See what's moved in each frame, and if everything's all blurry, it freaks out, doesn't know what to do. So if you see all this sort of weirdness happening in the frame where it's all sort of jumping around and being a bit odd, then that's too low light. The other one is that the ISO will then go up really high and the shot will get really grainy, or it'll just be too dark. Now the other thing to consider with this is it's an action camera, right? So when we're looking at using an ND filter and thinking about the amount of light that's coming into the camera, we've got to remember a lot changes. The light changes a lot while we're riding. You want something that gives you a certain amount of flexibility. I'm going to switch back to my go-to is normally an ND8, but considering it's bright, sunny, not a cloud in the sky, I'm going to go to an ND16, which I think is going to be the optimal. So generally, on a day like today, I'd go for an ND16 in the middle of the day, and then as the sun starts to drop, then I'd swap back to an ND8. And then once it gets to dark, then I would go back to the naked. So pretty much I run an ND8 as default any time of the day, and then run no filter, run naked at night time. Hope that helps with ND filters. Hope that gives you some insight if you're thinking about using them. Key thing to remember if you are thinking about using them is that you don't want them getting in the way of you having fun. At the end of the day, you don't want it to become a thing where you've got to constantly think about it, because it is something that you actually need to think about. The whole point of what we're doing using an ND filter is to essentially make it look like we're moving. It just looks more natural, it looks more realistic. You know, it's like bad special effects. You don't really know what's wrong, but you just know something's wrong.